Conor McGregor is the biggest star in the history of mixed martial arts. I don't think anyone would dispute that at this point. He set all the records, he makes the UFC more money in a night than they'll make for most of the rest of the year, he's moved into pop culture icon territory where people outside our MMA bubble find him fascinating. And let's be honest here, with the massive stardom comes a different set of rules than the rest of the fighters on the roster. As Conor himself once said, covered in Gucci mink, without him this whole ship sinks. And today we are going to explore just how far Conor can go beyond those rules that other fighters must abide by. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point, and here are the 10 things only Conor McGregor could get away with. Number 10. Showing up late to everything. Conor McGregor is not exactly the most punctual person. He has his own time that he goes by, and according to him, at the UFC 205 press conference, he's actually early to most of these press events. But in reality, Conor is extremely late to nearly all of them. UFC fans are now well aware that whenever there is a McGregor press event being held, they can probably hold off for 30 to 45 minutes after the scheduled time to even tune in. As a matter of fact, the UFC rarely even starts them without McGregor being there, as Conor is the reason we're all watching in the first place. So they stall as long as they can. And this was brought to hilariously long levels of stalling when both McGregor and Mayweather took their sweet time in New York for a press conference leading up to their boxing match. Poor Dougie Fresh. Part of being the champ is showing up to events whenever you feel like it, and nobody could get away with that besides the notorious one. Number 9. 511 days. When Conor McGregor captured the lightweight title at UFC 205 against Eddie Alvarez, it was a crowning achievement for McGregor and one of the biggest and most iconic moments in the sport's history, Conor straddling the cage with 2 world titles. Of course, that was just for show since the featherweight title was vacated at that point, but our number 9 entry has to do with just how long Conor held that lightweight title. Now, there have been fighters who have held belts longer without any activity in the UFC. Dominic Cruz held his title for 1,117 days before he finally vacated it. But Cruz's situation was due to injury. It was due to an uncertainty about whether or not he could physically compete again. Also, he was the champion of the bantamweight division and not the biggest star in the history of the sport. There weren't exactly a ton of people waiting for him to relinquish the title. Conor, however, reigned over the lightweight division for 511 days, despite there being absolutely no issues with his health, and with seemingly no timetable for his return to fighting. Even now, Conor has still not yet competed again, although he's finally scheduled. Nobody in the UFC's history that is perfectly healthy but is simply not going to fight for over a year would ever be able to hold a title that long. But when you're Conor McGregor, you're Conor McGregor. Number 8. Dictating his own fights. Now, there is a caveat here, as Conor is most definitely the type of fighter who will take on anyone at any time. We've already seen this in action several times in his career. When Aldo pulled out of their fight, he fought Mendez on short notice. When RDA pulled out of their fight, he fought Diaz on short notice. At 170 pounds. Like an insane person. But make no mistake about it, Conor McGregor could ask for any opponent, and it is absolutely who he would get. After winning the featherweight title, Conor set his eyes on the lightweight title despite having never defended his featherweight crown. He was allowed to shoot up to the top of the next division over and give that belt a go too. Of course, he ended up fighting Nate Diaz at that point, and we all know how that turned out. Now, you would think if it were anyone else at this point, the UFC would say, hey, now it's time for you to go back down to that division you got a belt in and defend it. Well, not if you're Conor McGregor, then you rematch Nate Diaz at welterweight because that's the fight you wanted to do. And then you go on to fight for the lightweight title of the world. That featherweight division is for the birds. Fighters get a bit of leeway in their matchmaking, especially champions, but nobody runs the show like Conor McGregor. Number 7, co-promoting an event with the UFC.
It's on their canvas.
And Conor...
It's on their canvas. Like his blood will be on their canvas.
For years and years, the UFC has had a simple policy that has kept the strength of their brand up in a harsh MMA landscape where interest in the sport on a mainstream level comes and goes. They do not lessen the importance of their brand. Nothing is above the UFC. And as such, they do not co-promote because they're the biggest show in town. That's just how these things work. Oh, Fedor, the most legendary heavyweight of all time, will come over if we let the event be co-promoted by M1 Global? You can just stay in Russia, Fedor, because that's not going to happen in a million years. Except if you're Conor McGregor. Then the UFC will co-promote. They'll co-promote an event that isn't even in the same sport. And not only will they co-promote it with a boxing company like Floyd Mayweather's Mayweather Promotions and Showtime, they'll co-promote it with your company you just launched, McGregor Sports and Entertainment. Never have we seen the UFC break their rule of co-promotion with other organizations, and the only time we'll ever see it again is if Conor McGregor's name is involved. Number 6, showing up at a rival promotion and attacking a referee. Oh, that Conor McGregor has gotten to some shenanigans in his time off since UFC 205. In November of last year, Conor showed up to Bellator 187 in Dublin to support his teammate Charlie Ward. So far, that's just fine. Lots of UFC fighters attend Bellator events, but very few of them end up being the center of Bellator's promotion for the event because they jumped into the cage after a fight and then began a beef with respected referee Mark Goddard. Oh, Conor also slapped a commissioner in the face. This event was controversial in that literally nothing happened to Conor because of this event, although that shouldn't be a surprise, he is Conor McGregor, but Bellator saw dollar signs and their ads for the airing of the taped event in the US heavily featured McGregor. No other fighter on the roster could have caused such mayhem and also helped promote the number 2 brand in the sport without catching some serious heat over at Zuffa HQ. But when you're Conor McGregor, it's just another thing you did once that people talked about. Number 5, taking 2 years off. Now, there are of course fighters who take time off from the sport for various reasons and then later return back to the UFC, but nobody can leave for 2 years and then come back as if nothing has happened in that time whatsoever. Not only is it as if nothing has happened in that time, as Conor is now set to take on Khabib Nurmagomedov for the lightweight title that was stripped of him after 511 days, but Conor could have virtually done anything when he returned. If he wanted a fight, that was the fight he was going to get. If Conor had said, "I'm fighting for the welterweight title," we'd be talking about McGregor versus Woodley right now.
That's the seed, you dumb fucks. That's the seed.
What's happening here?
All that despite taking 2 years away from the UFC cage when he is literally the biggest and strongest pay-per-view draw the company has. Even the biggest rivalry in the history of the sport between Daniel Cormier and John Jones couldn't draw a million buys in his absence. But it is exactly that reason that Conor is right back at the top of the card now that he's ready to make his return. Because in Conor's own words,
The double champ does what the fuck he wants!
Number 4, leaving to go box. This is most definitely the only fighter who could get away with this, and I would imagine it was partly because of that co-promotion we talked about in our number 7 entry. At the height of his popularity, Conor McGregor left the sport of mixed martial arts as we discussed, and decided to try his hand at fighting the best boxer of all time, despite having 0 professional boxing matches in his career. Yeah, sure, of course, Conor, go for it. We'll all be back here in MMA waiting for you when you're done with that. No other fighter in the UFC's history has ever been allowed to branch out like this, despite many of them entertaining the idea in the past. Anderson Silva has many times expressed interest in the boxing world, including during his epic run as middleweight champion. But come on, Anderson, who are you to get to jump into the boxing world? You're certainly not Conor McGregor, and nobody else is either when it comes to something like this. No other fighter in the UFC's history has left for another combat sport at the height of their UFC drawing power, and the only person this will ever work for is Conor McGregor. Who knows, with Mayweather-Pacquiao 2 in talks, maybe we'll see Conor do this whole dance yet again in his prime as a UFC fighter. Number 3, missing the UFC 200 press conference. After taking over the entire MMA world and then being defeated by Nate Diaz, it looked like the rematch between the two fighters was set to be the biggest of all time. And wouldn't you know it, that's exactly what it was. But of course, it was meant to take place on the epically significant UFC 200 card. They even made the Octagon gold that night, you guys. But Conor skipped the major press conference for that event, even though he was scheduled to do so. He was too busy training or healing up in Iceland or something. We never got the full story. Whatever the case was, he just flat out didn't come to the press conference, despite being the thing that most people watch those press conferences for. The UFC was very, very mad about this. In fact, they pulled him from UFC 200, the card that featured the return of Brock Lesnar after 5 years away from the sport, the card that sold over 1 million pay-per-view buys on its own. And they moved Conor's fight with Nate Diaz to UFC 202, where Conor and Nate would set the all-time pay-per-view buy record. What a rough time for the UFC. I'm sure they were devastated to get 2 million buy pay-per-views out of this situation instead of just 1. A similar act was pulled by the nearly untouchable Nick Diaz for UFC 137, and he was just straight up pulled from his title fight with George St. Pierre, proving that not even Nick Diaz is Conor McGregor. Number 2, the can throwing incident. Well, the UFC got that McGregor-Diaz press conference they wanted, despite showing up late for the UFC 202 press conference, as he now does for every press event, no big deal. McGregor and Diaz didn't even really have much of a press conference at all. Once Conor took the stage, Diaz, who had been waiting for some time, decided he was done answering questions that day and headed for the exit with a bit of sign language directed towards Conor McGregor. Of course, Conor, having taken Diaz's message as a threat, hilariously told Diaz and his crew,
"You'll do fucking nothing."
But they did do something. They threw beverages in Conor's general general direction. Now, it looked as if what they were throwing were empty to half-empty bottles of water, as well as some fountain drinks. Conor, on the other hand, was chucking full cans of Monster Energy drink into a crowd of fans in order to hit Diaz and his team. Now, granted, even Conor overstepped on this one in the eyes of the UFC. You can see from Dana's reaction during the event. But despite hitting security personnel with full cans of energy drink and putting people in danger, this event really didn't lead to any sort of issues for Conor. After all, this was going to be the biggest rematch in the history of the UFC, and the show must go on. Luckily, nobody got sent to the hospital. Surely if Conor did that, there would be some sort of repercussions. Oh wait. Number 1, the bus incident. You knew it was coming. The most recent insanity in the McGregor saga is most definitely Conor's attack on a UFC bus full of fighters leading up to UFC 223. Earlier that fight week, video was shown of McGregor's friend and teammate Artem Lobov being aggressively spoken to by Khabib Nurmagomedov, and Conor didn't like that one bit. So he and a group of his friends flew all the way from another continent to New York to have a conversation with Khabib and his team. After secretly being let into the Barclays Center by members of the media outlet that he owns, because of course he does, he's Conor McGregor, Conor found himself a bit late to the press conference. No surprise there, but that's okay. He and his buddies found the bus that Khabib was on leaving the event, and so began to throw things at it. Not Monster Energy cans this time, but moving equipment and even attempting to throw a barrier. This time, several people were injured and had to go to the hospital, and parts of the UFC 223 event had to be changed due to this attack. Conor may be above the MMA world, but he's not above the law, and did get in a bit of trouble for this incident. I believe he's got some anger management courses to complete for the state of New York. But in terms of the UFC and what this meant for Conor's future, despite Dana saying this was the most disgusting thing that's ever happened in the UFC's history, Conor's New York State punishment was more than enough. And now here we are on the precipice of the biggest UFC fight of all time, and who else would be in that fight but Conor McGregor? Thanks for watching. Please give us a like and subscribe. We've got 3 new videos or more for you every single week. Is there something else Conor can get away with that nobody else can? Let us know in the comments below. Huge shout out to Thomas Walsh for editing this video together. Follow him on Instagram at BigBeatVisual. Follow On Point MMA on Twitter, and have yourself a wonderful day.
Of weeks separating us and UFC 229 now, the headlines have certainly been dominated by Conor McGregor. That's to be expected considering the amount of fame that surrounds him at the moment, but what about Khabib? Hardcore fans have certainly gotten to know him well over the last 6 years since he debuted in the UFC in 2012, but many new fans are being introduced to him for perhaps the first time. That's in part because this is only the second time he's ever headlined a card. The fiasco of UFC 229